So the National Director of Public Prosecutions, Advocate Shamila Batohi, says the National Prosecuting Authority's comeback story after state capture has been nothing short of remarkable. Batohi hosted a media roundtable on efforts to rebuild the NPA post-state capture. This year marks 5 years since Batohi was appointed to the position. One of the biggest challenges she was facing was that she faced was with the time turning around the NPA that had been ravaged by state capture. Has the NPA's turnaround been successful? Let's now bring in Advocate Stefanie Fick. She is the Executive Director of Accountability Division at OUTA, and also Michael Marchant, who is the Head of Investigations at Open Secret. Good morning to both of you, and thank you so much for making time for us.
Good morning.
Morning.
Advocate Fick, let's start off with you. So Shamila Batohi is saying that what has happened with the NPA is nothing short of remarkable, taking into consideration the impact of state capture. But I want to start off here, though. If you look at the 5 years in office, the promises that were made during the interviews and the promises that were made after the appointment, how would you rate Shamila Batohi's tenure in office? She's now 5 years into her 10-year term. Out of 10, what would you give her?
Probably, 5 out of 10. And I would like to explain that in the sense that I do not envy anybody that had to take over that position. It was a daunting task. And, kudos to her as, female to female, that it is a very important position. And that I do think that they made an enormous amount of stride in their quest to rebuild an extremely important organization. I mean, constitutionally, they have to do the duty to prosecute. But then on the other hand, I think the question is, as society, do we feel the impact? Have we seen positive prosecutions? Have we seen state capture individuals being prosecuted? Have we seen a turnaround in how many cases we prosecute? Did we make a dent in, for example, our horrible crime rate? And then the answer, unfortunately, is no. So she gets points for trying to sort out the organization, but unfortunately one has to deduct some for the fact that if we look at successful state capture prosecutions, unfortunately the answer is no.
Okay. Michael, your take out of 10, what would you give Shamila Batohi?
I think that's the account that Stefanie has given is a very fair one, to be honest, is that some steps have been taken both by Shamila Batohi and the rest of the NPA leadership to turn around an institution that was gutted by years of political interference, infighting, an exodus of skills, which makes the job incredibly difficult to do. I think that, as we've said, ultimately, the NPA will have to stand or fall on successful prosecutions. And although we've seen some successful prosecutions more broadly when it comes to corruption and complex fraud cases, we haven't seen them regarding the prominent, politically connected and state capture related cases. And I think if we were to kind of pin down the single biggest failure of the NPA in this period, it's to strategically identify which state capture cases it can pursue successfully in a short period of time, because not all of them are possible to do in 5 years, and start to demonstrate to the public that there can be accountability for high-profile cases. It's one thing to point to a high conviction rate percentage, but for the public, when you don't really know what those prosecutions are because they're not linked to kind of cases fundamental to the state capture rot that we saw, it's very difficult to have trust. And so I think that's really what has to bring the score down, so to speak.
So I would say 5 out of 10 means, sure, there has been efforts that have been made, but it is still a fail. And I just want to also bring this element in. So remember that when she was appointed, in the opening remarks of the president back then in December 2018, he made reference to the Constitutional Court judgment that an NDPP must be appointed within 90 days. And this is what the Constitutional Court said. It said that With a malleable, corrupt, dysfunctional prosecuting authority, many criminals, especially those holding positions of influence, will rarely, if ever, answer for their criminal deeds. So there has been work now to try and stabilize the NPA. However, though, during the press briefing, she makes reference to, for instance, a John Block, and says that, well, there was a conviction of John Block, but if you look at John Block's conviction, that was in 2016. That was before she became the NDPP. She does speak about a former president who is being prosecuted. And do we give a brownie points for that, that there is a former president who is before a court of law, who is being prosecuted? On the other end as well, you have former ministers as well. I'm now thinking about Bongani Bongo as well, who is appearing in court on corruption charges. The former Speaker of Parliament as well. Advocate Fick, let's start off with you.
I think it's good to hear these names. We must just always remember that prosecutions are not always about, the names in the news. It's also about, just prosecuting criminals. So I don't always like that one hangs on the more familiar names on and say, this is why we have been successful. So although, yes, that is a success, of course, we want all criminals to go, to be prosecuted and then hopefully be found guilty and go to jail and be held accountable. But it is the spread. Can we see a difference? Do we get the impression that we can now trust the prosecuting authority to look after prosecutions in South Africa? Now, let me just, I have to say this, I don't necessarily blame her per se. She is but a person that was appointed in an organization with many moving parts. And also the NPA is an organization within machinery with many moving parts. So instead of focusing a lot on the NPA, which we have to do, and I appreciate that we need to look at the pros and cons. And I think that there will always be. There's the criticism, and then there's the positive prosecutions. Were there enough? No. But have we seen enough in the change that there's now a political will to give enough resources to an organization that does not have enough? They don't have the people. They don't have the skills in order to go after the high-profile prosecutions. Yeah. And that, I think, is also a question we need to ask. Not just how successful Shamila Batohi has been, but how successful have we been in order to give them as an organization the tools in order to effect proper prosecutions. And I don't think we are there yet.
Michael, do you get a sense and an appreciation of the difficulty around prosecuting state capture-related corruption allegations? Because here's the thing about it. Essentially, some people are accused of committing crimes against the state. And if you listen to Shamila Batohi speaking about working, for instance, with private companies who are assisting the NPA, and sometimes even there's money that is being made available to prosecute directors within the company that have been accused of corruption allegations, why can't that happen with the state? If we say, for instance, Eskom, what documents does Eskom have on hand that it can give to the NPA and say, this is the evidence that we have, go ahead and prosecute?
So, Aldrin, I think, these are important questions. On the question of, the names that we hear of people in court, I think it links to this question. What we have to be very cautious of is that what we've learned over the last 5 or 6 years is that arrests are one thing, enrolling a matter in court is one thing, but actually successfully prosecuting a case is very different. And what we've seen is a number of cases, the New Lane trial, Marcelo Coco's matter being struck off the roll. Those are high-profile cases where there's some movement, but then there's stumbling around process, getting of evidence, and things of that nature. And that remains, I think, a massive stumbling block. I think that in terms of the large corporate cases, there's a lot that's been made of this alternative dispute mechanism. I think our concern remains you have to demonstrate an ability to prosecute in order to entice corporations into a deal like that. I think, Shamila Batohi and others have said there has to be the carrot and the stick. At the moment, there's development of the carrot, but there's probably not enough of a threat a credible threat of a meaningful prosecution in order to bring those companies to the table. And so even if you want to develop a system like that, you have to make sure that you get the basics of the prosecution right. In terms of cases like Eskom, the one thing that I would just say, and Stefanie knows this very well coming from OUTA, the concern is that there are many cases around Eskom, PRASA, and other places where civil society organizations have had access to primary documents leaks, have taken material to the Hawks, to law enforcement, and to the NPA with detailed evidence that they can then follow up, also showing them where to look for things, and yet it has still been an incredibly slow process. And I think that's also where some of the concern comes in from the public, is that the Zondo Commission, civil society, have done a huge amount to uncover the type of evidence that you would need. The complex cases will inevitably take a very long time, but I think within that, there are cases that we think should have proceeded in the time available, and that prosecutions at least should have started.
Michael and Advocate Fick, thank you so much for your time. I would have loved to have your thoughts around blaming also the court system around the slow rate in judgments, but unfortunately we're out of time. That is Advocate Stefanie Fick, who is OUTA's Executive Director, and also Michael Marchant, Head of Investigations at Open Secrets. What's your assessment of Shamila Batohi's tenure in office? You can tweet at Newzroom 405.